This is the Content Strategy Insights podcast, episode number 192. If you've ever worked in or around support documentation or technical communication, you've probably come across the DITA standard for creating and managing structured content. Michael Priestley developed this standard during his long tenure at IBM. DITA, an acronym for Darwin Information Typing Architecture, arose from the need for Michael and his colleagues to help users of IBM products by sharing the same topical content across different channels.
Welcome to the Content Strategy Insights podcast, where accomplished content strategy experts share their wisdom with our friends in the content community. Our mission is to democratize content strategy, to make its principles and practices accessible to everyone. And now, here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode number 192 of the Content Strategy Insights podcast. I am super delighted today to welcome to the show Michael Priestley. Michael is currently the principal information architect and taxonomist at Avalara.com, the big tax software services company. But welcome to the show, Michael. Tell the folks a little bit more about what you're doing these days.
Sure. So I'm reorganizing a website, which is my weirdly happy place. So it's funny, sort of when I spent most of my career at IBM in a lot of different sort of content related roles. But the last thing I was doing there was working on their website, and it was, a challenging large website. I came up with a number of strategies, and then I got the opportunity to sort of potentially execute them in a different space with a different set of web pages. And it was a really good opportunity. It's a really supportive team. They're excited. They support information architecture. They support thinking about content. Got a great executive team, great set of coworkers. And it's been an exciting couple of years just working on menus and metadata. And it's satisfying.
Well, I think that alone will warm the cockles of the hearts of many of my listeners, because that's where we've all been a lot as building. But you're doing it at kind of a scale. Like you mentioned, you were at IBM for a long time. One of your many accomplishments there was the introduction, and this is why I wanted to have you on the show today. One of your many accomplishments there was you kind of, I don't know, is it fair to say you created or you sort of at least codified what's now called DITA, the Darwin Information Typing Architecture for Structured Content? It's hard to say where to start, but can you do a short version of that origin story of DITA?
Yeah, sure. It was, I feel like we need one of those like musical, like it was a time of war, kind of, sort of Warring Kingdoms or something. It was a really interesting time in IBM technical documentation. We had a whole bunch of writers. We had what was supposed to be the corporate standard, which was an SGML standard, IBM IDDoc. But there were a lot of groups that were not using it. And my group is actually one of the groups that was not using it. We had sort of tried it for a while and then bounced off and gone to using just plain HTML, authoring directly in HTML. And we had developed our own little toolkits to do extra fancy things with it. And we were very happy with it. And every year we got an exemption that allowed us to keep doing that instead of moving into HTML. So they set up a new initiative to sort of do the next version of the corporate standard using sort of the introduction of XML as a standard as the excuse to sort of revisit the architecture. And I got to be the rep for the IBM, at that time, Toronto lab. And as luck would have it, I also had some XML sort of familiarity. I was working on a product that used a lot of XML internally. I had sort of figured out how to write XSLT to do little scripts with our HTML. And so I was very excited by that opportunity. And it ended up involving, I was supposed to be on there as a sort of an SME or representative of the user base because I was a writer and I was an information architect. I ended up actually leading the sort of the work group within that effort to codify the DTDs. And I think, so in that respect, I can absolutely say, sort of there are key parts of DITA that I can say sort of came out of this head as opposed to elsewhere. But I also want to be clear that there were a whole lot of really good cooks in that kitchen. And also there were a lot of things that people sort of attribute to DITA because they learned it from DITA, but that predate DITA. And the concept task reference thing was already a standard within IBM. People were supposed to be doing that in the SGML standard. It was part of our sort of our big sort of book of guidelines for writing technical documentation called Developing Quality Technical Information, which is yeah, it's been a while since there's been a new edition of that, but at the time it was one of the really great books for technical writing. And so going into that sort of team, sort of with representatives from across IBM, all these different communities, I think I ended up being a champion for that writing mode and for the need to sort of support that, concept, task, reference, information typing. But there were a lot of other pressures in there. And the sort of Don Day was, I think, my antagonist and then collaborator. Was sort of, he was not bought into that way of thinking about content, and had a vision in his mind of a very simple, pure architecture of sort of nesting divisions that sort of allowed for some very straightforward, very scalable sort of markup sort of situations. And I eventually figured out a way, and I do get to claim this one, sort of the simple sort of model of specialization that allowed us to say sort of we can actually think of concept, task, and reference as being specialized from a common generic ancestor, and we can further specialize from concept, task, and reference, or from topic especially, to create any set of information types we want that will all have these same basic characteristics of, a title, potentially a short description. That was something you could leave out if you wanted to, but then, sort of a body with content, and you can use the specialization to decide what you're going to allow and where you're going to allow it.
Yeah,
And so,
because at
yeah,
that time, that notion, it was kind of those three things, like concept, tasks, and reference materials. Did you come up with the innovation of putting topics on top of that as an organizing way? And was that kind of a way to not appease, but kind of address the concerns of your collaborators?
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And credit where it's due. I think I had originally gone in with the goal to do specialization, but really only thinking of the reference arm of that, because I knew we had a lot of different sort of specialized reference vocabularies for, command line documentation or API documentation, various sort of realms of reference information. And so I knew I wanted to do it there, but moving that idea sort of up a level and bringing in sort of that sort of the pure notion that Don had of the simple nesting, but extensible nesting, and saying, okay, let's take that and then overlay it with a concept, sort of a typing architecture, an information typing architecture. That was sort of the first sort of breakthrough to let our two groups sort of work together and actually have that common ground.
Is that where the name, because it's DITA stands for Darwin Information Typing Architecture. Is that where the name comes from? Was in that era?
Exactly. Yeah, it was the idea that it's about information types, but it's not just a set of information types. It's an information typing architecture. And then we needed, like, there was a lot of argument of what's that first word going to be. And the sort of the notion of specialization sort of tied conceptually to the notion of, sort of genetic or sort of Darwinian specialization. And so we borrowed Darwin's name and slapped it on there, and I hope he forgives us.
That's right. A random aside. That's about the era when I was transitioning from college textbook publishing to digital work. And the last book I published was the general biology book by Neil Campbell, which was the best-selling book ever in that field. And it was like many books at the time, but specifically and deeply focused on adaptation. So it was in the air apparently in that in that era. But hey, but I want to backfill just a little bit to it. You mentioned a couple of acronyms that I want to make sure some of folks who aren't in the technical documentation world might not get, like DTD. That's just the document type definition. That's sort of like a kind of a level above what most people see when they're working with an HTML document, just kind of to say what a document is, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, exactly. You could have I can't remember now if there is a formal DTD for HTML. There used to be, but it's a document that lays out in a very specific syntax the rules of a markup language. So like, here's what the root element is going to be. Here's what's allowed under the root for each element. What are the attributes that are going to be allowed? What are the child elements that will be allowed? That whole set of rules and the, sort of the content models of each part of the document, and then sort of building up to the document as a whole.
Yeah, and kind of alongside of that, you also mentioned XSLT, which is a really interesting thing because it's sort of like it's a thing that's built with itself to do recursion. So it's recursive all day long. Can you talk a little bit about the role of XSL? Because Darwin Information Typing Architecture is a specific standard to format XML. And the whole point of XML is that you can do stuff with it. And that's what XSLT does, correct? Is that?
Yeah. So it's an interesting sort of, I want to make the distinction between the markup standard versus the processing standard, because the processing standard isn't actually a standard, really. I mean, what people think of as the processing, those set of XSLT transforms are not part of the standard. They're part of the open toolkit, or they're part of, sort of lots of people have done their own versions of them well, or in not always in XSLT. But the core standard of DITA is sort of processing agnostic. Like, we don't say you got to use XSLT. We don't say how you're going to process this stuff. We just say, like, this is the intent of the markup, and these are the rules for the markup. And there's a few places where we talk about, like, if you've got an attribute that references, like, one of the mechanisms is sort of reuse of a single, like, element. Like, you say, I want to pull this paragraph from someplace else, or I want to pull this this sentence or word or list item or whatever it is from someplace else. We say how that gets processed, because there are particular rules in DITA to make sure that running that is not going to bust open the processing model and suck in some giant table into the middle of your title that will break things. So we have some rules there, but generally speaking, it's very neutral. And then the XSLT, we actually tried to contribute that to the same standard organization, because we had developed them within IBM. Sort of, the same group developed the document type definitions and the processing, sort of code. But they were like, no, we only own the standard, not the code. So we set up the open toolkit to be the, sort of as a SourceForge project to sort of be the recipient of that transfer of IP.
Interesting. Yeah. So then a minute ago, I want to jump to something you said just a minute ago about reuse. And we were talking just before we went on the air about my assumption that the whole genesis of DITA was around the need for reuse. And you're like, well, kind of. Can you talk about, like, the subtle difference between what I assume that I think many people assume about the origins of DITA to be mostly about reuse, what you actually created it for?
Yeah, sure. So again, sort of going back to that concept task reference sort of distinction, the best practices within IBM for writing documentation as a book or as a web page, it was the same standard. And it was, content needs to be modular and it needs to be built for retrieval and understanding. And I saw a little screen flicker there. Am I still coming through okay?
Yeah, you sound good. Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. So our goal was to sort of have an architecture that reflected that use model, right? We want to sort of make content that is organized around topics that people are looking for and helps them solve the problem they've got, or understand the thing they need to understand, or look up the thing they need to look up. And so organizing content that way was in service of our best understanding of user needs. And then the fact that that also made content reusable was a bonus. It was an effect. I mean, and it was a thing that we used to get into arguments at the time, because there were lots of people like, this is a limiting use model. Like, sort of this insistence that sort of the topic in DITA, which is sort of like your section, or, it's a title and some content that sort of describes how to do a task, or it explains a concept, or, sort of documents a piece of code or API or something. The idea that that has to be the primary unit of reuse, like we had people with, databases built to be, deconstructing documents down to the sentence level, and they were like, you are so limited. We are so much more powerful than that, and you are so parochial in your focus on this meaningless unit. And I was like, the unit of use is the unit of reuse. You start reusing everything at the sentence level, you're going to have to validate every instance of reuse, because those sentences don't form the same sense in different collections. But if something at the topic level, if someone's flipping through a book and hits that topic, it needs to make sense on its own, because they're not going to read the previous three pages to make sense of it. At least they shouldn't have to, right? The content needs to be organized to support their moment of, need, not the author's sort of narrative exposition instinct, right? And so that idea of like, we need the content to be organized and chunked to support the user. And once it's organized and chunked, you can reuse those chunks because they're carrying a bunch of their information with them, and they're likely to be useful in other contexts with a few simple switches. Like maybe we swap out a variable, maybe there's a sentence we need to swap out or do something, but 90% the same. And there's a lot of cases like that where you can do that, especially across channels. Like if you're talking about content we want to embed in a help system versus content we want to sort of publish on a website versus content you want to publish in a book. A lot of the times it's the same paragraphs, it's the same sentences. And if you mess with that order, it stops making sense. But if you preserve that order, you can combine them in a lot of different ways very usefully. And
Right.
yeah.
And that ability to sequence things that's the mapping function within DITA, right? Which is sort of the thing that is like, I guess, conceptually alongside the topical and structure stuff and the mapping assembly stuff. Is that the correct way to think about it? Or
Yeah. Sort of, I used to sort of think of it sometimes in terms of like three C's. We had the content, which are these, or sort of chunks of content, and then we had the collection of that content via maps, and then we had the categorization or classification of that content using metadata. And that was sort of the three big tasks of sort of working in DITA.
Yeah, interesting. Hey, one thing you just said a minute ago, you mentioned like the reuse follows use and that focus on usability. It's like it reminds me of like back in that era, like what we call like help stuff now was called user assistance then. And I wonder if that was that lingo common at IBM, is that where that notion of use as the fundamental kind of driving principle behind this came from?
I don't know if that's where the fundamental principle came from. I think we've been focused on the user like in lots of different ways, sort of in across different parts of the organization. But certainly user assistance, like that was one of the names we called ourselves at one point. Like we were technical writers, we were information developers, we were user assistance writers, we were content developers, there were some other words, like I lost track at some point. So yeah, user assistance was definitely in that mix. And certainly, I think thinking about online help as one of the contexts in which your information is going to be consumed and needs to make sense was definitely like books, the web, help were probably the three main sort of use cases for DITA, sort of as we were setting up the architecture, making sure that we could produce content that would be useful in those three contexts.
Interesting. And to have it ready for each of those gets back to that. I wanted to revisit something you said too about working with writers working within these systems, the content creators, the authors. Is this where because there's this authoring difference that needs to happen, writing to these use specific topical chunks versus writing a narrative script of like, hey, here's how you operate this machine, or here's how you fix this problem. Was there like a lot of work to be done around working with the content creators in like the rollout and adoption of this standard?
There was, but not as much as you might think. Just because we had, like I said, we already had the Developing Quality Technical Information book that was already talking about writing content in chunks organized around concept, task, and reference. So a lot of these concepts were already familiar, and it was suddenly we were giving them a tool that supported the training they'd already been given. And so for some writers, it was very welcome. Like I got writers who were just like deliriously happy because we were finally giving them a tool that worked the way they worked. We had other writers who had never really accepted that direction from the DQTI book. And they were like, so they were already resistant, you know what I mean? They were already digging in their heels against the direction they'd been given. And the old tool let them get away with it, and the new tool didn't. And so they hated the new tool. But some of them came around and some of them never did. I'll be honest. But it certainly wasn't a battle that we were fighting on behalf of DITA. I think it was a battle we were fighting on behalf of our corporate standards, which were genuinely in the service of our users' needs. And DITA was a tool in that, sort of ongoing education. It was a tool that was making it easier to do what we thought the right thing was, and what I still think the right thing was. which was to write this content around what users are looking for and what they're trying to do, rather than writing a big, cohesive, needs to be read in one piece document. And it's funny when I start, sort of that whole idea of like we need to write in chunks, that felt very natural to me. I think my first job at IBM as an intern was writing online help, and the idea that yeah, we need to write this stuff to make sense in the moment that it's needed. And then most people are not going to sit down before they use a program and read everything back to front. As a matter of fact, I was told to do that at one point in my internship, and it was the worst week of my life. Just sort of going into work every morning with a huge printed out manual and trying to read stuff without using it, and without like sort of applying it, and without sort of going back and forth between the task and the thing and explaining how to do. I could not stay awake. It was so hard, and so yeah, that really drove home to me. This is not the way people normally use these books. You don't use the book separate from the system. You don't use the help separate from the system, and you don't use, if we're talking about documentation of a product, then it lives in the context of the product's usage. There's a small amount that will be useful before the product, but most of it is for during the product. And once I started being challenged on that, this stuff that was sort of part of the water I had been sort of learned how to swim in. I went back and discovered that Jack Carroll's sort of minimalism beyond the Nuremberg funnel was all about this. And sort of his first example was taking the Smalltalk user's guide, which was explaining to programmers who had never done object-oriented programming before and had never done Smalltalk programming before what object-oriented programming was. And his answer was, this whole huge conceptually new paradigm is best explained by chunking it out into bits and then relating them in clear sort of progression with as little information as possible between them and the practice that will then inform their next question. Nice. And so yeah, there's some, as it turned out, we got it right, but we got it right instinctively, and then found the literature that backed us up, and found that other people had also gotten it right before us, if that makes sense.
No, it does. And it sounds like, just being at a place like IBM in that era, that was, that it's probably not unreasonable to trust your gut instinct about something like that. But hey, I want to bring this, I love sharing the story of the history of this stuff, but I want to jump to the present a little bit, because one of the things that, one of the things that proves the enduring validity and usefulness of DITA is that it's still widely used, and it's still useful to this day. It's kind of grown and evolved a bit. But do you take like, I don't know, not like pride, but just there must be some satisfaction in seeing your baby kind of like into its adulthood out in the world now?
Oh, completely. I'm so happy. I'm happy it's still useful. I'm happy it's still growing and changing. I've still got some connection to it, and I talk regularly with folks who are using it. I don't use it myself. My team doesn't use it, but I'm going to never say never, right? I would love to still see the opportunity to build some cross-disciplinary bridges, sort of figure out how marketing and tech comm will work together, how websites, sort of built on AEM or with structured content can be working with DITA as another source of structured content. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff and interesting opportunities there. But I'll just be frank, through all of this, I think the big challenges are not technical. Those are relatively solvable. And I think we've got sort of a good set of, all the people who are fighting for structured content are on the same side in this. And, DITA is just one of the flavors. And when people get into fights about this standard versus another, it's like, we're all fighting the same fight. It's us against like WYSIWYG. It's not, it's not us. It shouldn't be us against each other. If we can define the standard well enough to allow interchange, then I'm happy. But the big challenges are always political. And I don't even mean that. I don't mean that in the sense of person versus person. I mean in like org chart versus org chart. Mm-hmm. You've got one set of group that sort of with a set of performance indicators and budget that are aimed at one set of success criteria, and another group that's got a different budget and a different set of reports and a different set of success criteria. Figuring out how to take success from one and lend it to the other, or find where is the common benefit to the company funded. That's a political challenge, but it's one that's very hard to fight from the grassroots. So that's, I think, why you see sort of siloed content continue, not because of the inherent siloed nature of the content, but because of the siloed nature of the org charts that fund it.
That reminds me of another thing we talked about before we went on the air. I was telling you about a meetup that we convened in Amsterdam a few months ago, where we had the theme and the topic was structured content. And we had somebody from your family, like the DITA person, and then we had a guy who runs a big headless CMS at IKEA. We had a marketing person from Booking.com who works with structured content in a marketing context. And then we had an enterprise content strategist also in that meeting. And what the funniest thing was, just to what you were just saying, like, we need more assemblies like that, but also you've done most of that stuff in your career, right?
Yeah. I can't say I've run a headless CMS. Although I will say early versions of IBM's Knowledge Center were basically very similar. It evolved away from that towards a static publishing model, but the initial sort of paradigm we were shooting for was, I think, very similar in principle and in philosophy. It was just at the time we couldn't get the performance to scale, and that wasn't about the markup. That was about the technology at the time. I started in technical writing as a technical writer, then an IA, then sort of DITA came along, and I was a developer for that briefly, and then I was the sort of the lead strategist for our sort of technology strategy across IBM's documentation, and then that sort of moved into an enterprise content role where we were sort of trying to connect, sort of and find allies in, sort of training, sales, marketing, support, and work across all of that. And then I ended up landing out of that into a marketing role where I spent sort of the last sort of part of my career at IBM, including, sort of at the end, the taxonomy and then IA work there that led to my IA and taxonomy work here at Avalara. So yeah, I definitely see a lot of through lines there in terms of the things that made me like working in each of those things, and the things that I was interested in each of those spaces were very similar. And I think there's a lot of basic principles and basic approaches that should be cross-connectable. And again, the main challenges are in the org structure of the companies involved, rather than in any inherent difference between the types of content or the platforms involved.
Cool. That's kind of why I brought that up, because I've kind of given up on silo busting, but I believe in silo spanning, and I think you're just the guy to at least model it, if not do it. But hey, Michael, I can't believe it. We're already coming up close to time. But before we wrap up, is there anything you'd like to revisit from the conversation, or just want to make sure you share before we close?
Yeah, I guess I'll say, like, one thing just to sort of make explicit, like, for me, DITA and my contributions to DITA came from the space of someone using tools every day to address content challenges to try and make life better for our users. And that was sort of my driving motive, right? I was helping make tools that I would use myself, if that makes sense, which is always the easiest thing to do. Like, it's why open source sort of tools for developers are always so good compared to some other use cases. But I sort of feel like that's sort of what brought me to where I am now in sort of the marketing realm, is that urge to sort of get back to the space where I'm learning new things and understanding new things, and then hopefully getting to the point where I can start to generalize. And I definitely, coming back to that basic promise, I think there's some stuff that is common across all these different realms, and I would love to sort of, it's an ongoing preoccupation of mine to want to connect sort of with fellow authors, fellow sort of content discipline people across all the different parts. Sort of, we all share a part of that sort of user's journey. Let's try and sort of work together to sort of make their life better, because that's what we all want. And so,
As a former book editor, I want to make you write the book, Unified Theory of Content Practice or something. Hey, one very last thing, Michael. What's the best way if folks want to connect with you online or follow you? What's the best way to connect?
yeah, LinkedIn is probably the best way. So I'm the Michael Priestley. If you like, from a LinkedIn perspective, it's like linkedin.com/in/Michael-Priestley-CA, because I'm the Canadian one, and that'll find me there.
Excellent.
There's a lot of us floating around, but yeah,
The one and
so
only,
far I'm the yeah.
yeah, the one and only Canadian Michael Priestley. Thanks.
As soon as I say that, I know there's going to be another Canadian Michael Priestley sort of glaring at me, side-eyeing me from somewhere on the internet right now. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, he won't be on this podcast, I'm sure. So anyhow, well, thank you so much, Michael. This was a really fun conversation.
Thank you. I really appreciated the chance, and yeah, I love chatting with you.
Thank you for listening. If you can think of a friend who might enjoy this episode, please share it with them. And please join us again for our next content strategy interview.